am very glad to see you all this evening, be part of the opening time here. This is, to me, is one of my favorite times of this meeting. It's certainly a unique aspect of this meeting to have a spiritual emphasis like this as a formal part of our meeting. And there's, it has a value in and of itself. To be gathered like this, to be thinking about these things together, stimulating each other to love and good works, really. So thank you for letting me be a part of that. I was asked to talk about the idea of God's love flowing through global eye care and how that's happening. And the verse that I was asked to use for our reference tonight would be Psalms 36. For with you is the fountain of life, that theme of water as it flows out from God. In your light do we see light. So it's in God that we see the things that we really need to see around in ourselves and in the world around us. And we're going to talk a little bit about that this evening. I wanted to start by kind of stepping back a little bit and thinking about the fact that God has revealed His love. So, it's one thing to say God is love. It's another thing to realize that God has actually revealed Himself as a loving God. He didn't just show us that He's amazing and can create stuff and He's awesome and He can do miracles, but He's revealed something very specific about His nature and character, and that is that He's a God of love. So I wanted to get into that a little bit so we could think about God's love, His loving plan, how it's revealed in that, and then our place, my place, in that plan. And what does that tell us then about how we can relate to each other and the world around us? How has that impacted missions? Some of you know I recognize some of you out there. I'm very glad to see some old friends again. And some of you all have been very involved in global eye care initiatives in various ways. I certainly have been over the past 15 years. For those who don't know me, I've been quite involved. I left my practice in 2004, private practice, so that I could be fully engaged in international mission work, and have been doing so ever since. And it's been an opportunity to see God's love being demonstrated in a lot of different arenas, and we each have different little arenas in which we work. It just happens that the arena in which I've been able to see that has been quite a privilege for my wife and I, Kim and I, to experience together how God's love has been revealed in this broad arena of the global marketplace. So let me go into this a little bit about what God has done. So before the fall of man, so to orient you, so over on this side will be kind of the scene. What scene is this about? This is where we live, and here is God's heavenly realm. So we're just going to go through this real briefly. It'll give you a chance to kind of look at, maybe get a picture in your head of how God's love was revealed in some very specific ways over history. After the fall of man, we were separated from God, of course. We all recognize that a holy God and a fallen humanity were just not compatible. It wasn't going to happen. What God had designed, what God had created us for, was no longer really feasible anymore. And the problem was that then moved Satan's domain into the place that God had created. What was Satan's domain away from all that now was placed squarely in the middle of what God had designed. What a tragedy that was. So Satan thought that this would result in our annihilation, because what's God going to do? He had created this wonderful world, and those things are incompatible. So what's he going to do? Well, obviously, he lost. He's going to have to get rid of it. He's going to annihilate that which he created. That was Satan's idea. And being the master of lies, he thought he could do that by deceiving mankind. But God had another way of dealing with this. He was going to preserve. God's love was demonstrated in that instead of wiping out the creation that He made, He preserved it. He didn't have to do that, but He loved that which He had created, so He preserved it. So Satan had another way. Well, maybe I'll let them self-destruct. So you all know the stories, right? There's Noah and the flood. What was that? That was a result. That wasn't about a flood. That was about man trying to self-destruct. That's what prompted the flood to happen. So why did the flood happen? It was because God was trying to preserve us from self-destruction. All of the creation was going down the tube very rapidly. It was right near, remember the population of the world at that time Think about how long ago that was and how growth curve, population curves work. Population of the earth was not that big at that time. It wouldn't have taken much for the whole thing to self-destruct. But God preserved it by causing the flood, which sounds sort of paradoxical, but that's how he preserved mankind, was by doing that. God restrained evil. This pattern of the way God demonstrated his love was by using his power to restrain that which was going to destroy us. We were going to destroy ourselves, but he restrained the evil that was going to destroy us. So Satan, not to be frustrated, Satan says, okay, so I'll just let them die. That's a good answer to the problem. We'll just let humanity die, because death wasn't conquered. We weren't going to self-destruct as across the board, but we're just going to die. The curse had resulted in the death cycle starting. Creation was decaying. We had died spiritually. And you remember what happened? 900 years old, 500 years old, 100 years old, and now we maybe make it to 70 or maybe 80, depending on which country you live, or maybe 50 if you live in Africa. So it's, there's clearly in Satan's mind a chance to undo what God had done by just letting us die. But God had another plan. His love was demonstrated in that he showed that he could bring victory over death, and indeed he did through the resurrection of his son. Very practical demonstrations of God's love. So, okay. So Satan has said, okay, let them have that victory, but they will still fail at accomplishing anything because they are totally inept. They're imperfect. They will tell you, every one of us would sit here and tell us how imperfect we are. There's not a one of us who would stand up and say, I am perfect. I just wanted you to know. There's not a one of you that would say that. Well, Satan knew that too. He said, well, sure, I'll just let them be imperfect. No problem. And that's going to ruin the whole strategy. That's going to ruin everything. But God had another plan. God's love was demonstrated again. And how was it demonstrated? In that he took that which was imperfect, that is us, and he transforms it. He changes it to be like something that we could never have imagined we could be like. And that is that we could be like the perfect one, his son, Jesus, who is the one, by the way, who demonstrated his love by overcoming death. So I'm showing you a pattern here. I'm hoping you're picking up on a pattern of how God is demonstrating in very practical ways. He's revealing not just that he's a good God, he's revealing that he's a loving God over and over and over again. The faith that it takes for those things to make those things happen, it's incredible that all that is a gift. So those things happen as a result of God offering it to us. And he says, okay, I know you're not perfect. I know you can't do it. I know that there is nothing within you that wants you to have this, but I am going to plant in you a little seed. And it's this tiny little seed. In the Bible, they call it a mustard seed. It's a tiny little thing. And that little seed is going to do something that you would think unbelievable. It's going to change everything. And that's the seed of faith that God plants in our lives. Those who are willing to follow him. He plants that seed and it brings true life again. Okay, but still, that's fine for individuals. But there's a whole, the world wasn't set on autocorrect. So it transforms individuals. So there's some individuals that they get life. But Satan thinks this is about the whole of God's creation, and it is still going down the tube. There's still families falling apart. There's still sin everywhere. There's still rebellion against God. So I don't think there's going to be anything they're going to do that's going to result in anything positive. After all, the Tower of Babel was their first attempt to do that, wasn't it? They lifted themselves up because they were going to solve the problem. And what happened was clear that was another path to self-destruction. So God decides, okay, I've got a better way that this can happen. I'm going to show you what it means to love someone so much that I'm going to let them, even though they're imperfect, I'm going to let them work with me as partners in a heavenly calling. He calls it in Hebrews 3. What an incredible gift of love that is, that now we're able to not just, be transformed and go on our merry way, but we're actually able to work with God personally in this relationship that allows us to be part of the plan that He's executing in this world to restore and renew that which was ruined. Satan thought, there's no way this God's going to succeed with this. I've got everything I need to ruin His plan. But God's plan was quite the opposite. It was that He was going to use those things to achieve the very things that we had lost in the beginning. He was going to preserve, restrain, bring about transformation and a partnership that would last then for eternity for those who were following Him. God's love was going to be poured out, is what that means. God's love was going to be demonstrated and revealed, and these are all very practical ways that this was done. And sometimes it's hard to see, because we stand and we look at each other and we think, well, how did God love you, Eugene? Did he do this thing for you, is how we think of it. But if you stand back just a little bit, just think of the big picture of what God has done to allow us, each of us who are willing to follow Him, to be part of this incredible plan. That's how God reveals His love. That's how it's demonstrated, I think, to us. Ultimately, God's plan is going to be finished. Isn't it amazing to think that if it had happened at the very beginning the way that God had planned, we would be on a path where we'd be filling the earth and having dominion over all that God had created. And there was this big interval where seemed like it was in a mess, that it was going to fail. But because of God's love was revealed very specifically to allow us to continue the path to the completion of God's story. That's what we have now. So Satan exiled, God's plan is completed. So the fall of man should have been the end of the story, but it wasn't, because of God's love for His creation. The evil brought into the world should have resulted in the self-destruction of creation, but it didn't, because God lovingly restrained it. Jesus' death should have been the end of God's plan, but it wasn't, because God's loving submission to death was the means to defeat evil. He became a curse, it says. So what happened in the garden? We were cursed. So to undo that curse, somebody had to be cursed. That's exactly what happened when Jesus died on the cross, which was the symbol of this curse. So He became a curse to defeat evil. So Satan became his own worst enemy by having Jesus killed. Jesus' physical departure from earth should have ended the mission. He left, just not so long after He completed his mission. But it should have ended the mission. But it didn't, because God's love now fills and transforms us. And this is where I want to stop and just take a couple of minutes to think about what God is now doing, because this imperfection that we have should make it impossible to do this spiritual mission. It really should be impossible. But it isn't, because of God's loving partnership with us. So how does that work then? Many of us are ophthalmologists. I'm sure there's some kids and some family members and such as that here, but you're part of this whole story. You're part of this picture that God is working to bring about something where His love is revealed. Remember how practically speaking, it was so practically revealed in these things. It can still be practically revealed in the things that we do professionally. It can still be practically revealed in how we execute things in the way that we live. We're professionally qualified. We're uniquely gifted. And those are things that are specifically designed to demonstrate God's love in this world. That's how I've seen God's love flow in global missions. That's where I've seen it happen. That's where I've seen people like Nathan taking his life and saying, I'm going to go invest it in these people over here. Or I can name several of you. I've just felt like embarrassing him because he's sitting there and looks like he needs to be embarrassed for the moment, so that's why I embarrassed him. There's several of you I could say that about. God has taken you. Yes. Oh, Wendy. Wendy? Really? Oh, wow. Okay. So I didn't know Wendy was going to be here. That's exciting. So people that God is using to reveal His love in very practical ways. So there's not a tension in my mind between practical demonstration of love and this message of love. There is no conflict there, in my view. Sometimes we think, well, they're just being good humanitarians. Okay, they're going out there and they're just doing loving stuff and doesn't mean a thing because, they're just being nice. I can tell you the people that I'm talking about right now, they're not just being nice. They don't really like a lot of what they have to do. I'd be pretty sure. I haven't talked to Wendy in a while, but I know that's true for Nate. There's a lot of things he doesn't like about what he has to do, but he's doing that because it reveals something about God. That's the message that we can all participate in. Let me give you some specific ways then that I've seen it happen out there, out in the world. First of all, restoring sight to the blind does something very unique. You all know this, but sometimes you forget. And so I'm very happy just to remind you what a privilege it is to demonstrate God's love by opening the eyes of those who can't see. And for some of us that have the privilege of working in these places where people are really totally blind, that's fairly dramatic to see that happen. And I know that a lot of our practices, it's not that dramatic sometimes. But I bet you, each one of you has stories of patients who said, thank you so much. I've just been blessed by this new sight I have. I can see colors again. I can see the book I've been trying to read. Just think of how the quality of your work reflects on the love of the Creator, God. Secondly, our loving attitudes demonstrate something. And the attitude is a funny thing. It's sort of a fixed perspective is how I would define. This is not the feeling of kindness. That's not what I mean by attitude. What I mean by attitude is a fixed perspective about how things work. That's what I mean by attitude. Our attitude about the science that we use to do the work that we do, our attitude about the sanctity of man, our attitude about who people really are in God's big picture, that comes through. And I've seen it over and over again when patients would say something. They'll say something like this, Doctor, I've never had somebody who actually really seemed to care, not just about my eyeball, but about me. That's the message. That's the attitude that is such a testimony for the loving God who has enabled us to do this work. And lastly, you all know that ophthalmology is a team sport. That's a great thing for us. Unlike a lot of specialties, they can be the guy who goes in there and he's the macho surgeon. A good friend of mine is a VVF surgeon, OBF surgeon, and 4 hours later he comes out of the case and he's sweating, he's drenched with water, and meanwhile I've done 30 cataracts, and he just thinks it's the stupidest thing that I somehow think I've done something really special with because it took me 4 minutes to do this case. Meanwhile, 4 hours later, it takes him to come out. So for me, it's because I can do that as a team. I can do that with a group of people. And I would just encourage each of you to remember that you are not nearly as important as you think. You really are not. What people see is your team. That's what they see. I can guarantee you that's true in the mission field as it is in your practice. So I'd love it when I see a team who's dedicated themselves to demonstrating the love of Christ, to demonstrating His love. Because when they do, that's the opportunity for God to once again reveal His love for us to see. People in the dark must see love before they can receive love. It's sort of a truism, I suppose. There are fancier ways to say that, but I think the principle you would all understand immediately and agree with, that it's one thing to just talk about God's love. It's another thing to demonstrate it. I think that's why God didn't just say, hey, I'm a loving God, just wanted you to know. But unfortunately, that's sometimes what we do. Hey, I'm really a loving person. I just wanted you to know. Okay? Yes, I know I do all this other stuff that's not so loving, but I am a loving person. I just wanted you to know. It's in revealing that through ourselves that God shows that He is the God of love. It's revealed He reveals himself through us. And it's in the darkness that that's really seen. That's what shows up in the mission field. That's what people see when they are in these places that are full of darkness. They need to have hope. And it's in that hope that they can then receive the love that God has for them. So just a few things to suggest. There's some good reading, different things you can look at to this. And I've been honored over the years to be able to serve in international missions. It's been quite a privilege to do that. And I think it's an important thing for all of us not to all go out there and be missionaries in the international mission field. I've always hated the term missionary. In fact, those of you who know me, know pretty well that I don't like that word. It's just a funny word. I don't know what in the world it means, for one thing. And but it kind of creates this artificial separation. It's like, oh well, he's one of those missionary people. Well, no, I'm not one of those missionary people. We're all demonstrating the love of Christ is my main point here with all of this. That shows up around the world. It shows up in your place. And by the way, one of my first so I helped set up this clinic in Fort Worth, Texas, okay? Not somewhere else in the world, but in Fort Worth, just to do free cataract surgery for patient. Guess who the very first patient was that I did their cataract surgery? It was a lady from Ghana, because she was stuck here and her kids were trying to figure out a way. They couldn't send her home because she couldn't see. So she had no way to get home. So the very first patient I did here was a lady, and I went in. My wife, we had been in Ghana a number of times, and so she walked in and said "Akwaba, kwaba," which is sort of a greeting in that language. And the lady just beamed. I mean, she just lit up because she couldn't believe. Here she was in Texas, and someone was speaking to her in Twi, which is the language that they spoke there in Ghana. That's how God's love is magnified around the world. And it was right in Texas. So you have no excuse, Texas guy, and wherever else y'all are from, because I can tell you there are connections that God will make for his love to be revealed, no matter where you are and who you're talking to. Thanks.